He didn't ask questions. He didn't check his phone. He ran. Mason Reed sprinted down the gravel road after a semi-truck loaded with 6 dead engines, pounding his fist against the trailer, screaming for the driver to stop, because he'd just seen something on that steel that no one else on Earth would recognize. A billionaire had called these engines garbage. Mason knew better. He knew because he built them. And somebody had spent years making sure the world forgot that. Stick around, this story gets bigger than anyone expects. Tell me what city you're watching from tonight, and if you believe forgotten men deserve a second shot, hit subscribe before we start. The truck was already 30 yards past the shop when Mason saw it. He hadn't meant to look twice. He'd signed for the delivery, walked the length of the flatbed, once muttered something about 6 engines being an odd thing for a company like Hart Automotive, to dump on a repair shop in the middle of nowhere, and turned to go back inside where the space heater was still working and his coffee was still warm. Then the morning sun hit the side of the last engine block at just the right angle, and he saw it, a tiny stamp half buried under grime and rust. 3 letters and a number pressed into the casing by a machine only one shop in the entire state had ever owned. A machine he used to run himself 12 years ago, back when his hands didn't shake, and his name still meant something. MR7. His own initials. His own project number. Mason didn't remember deciding to run. His body just did it. He was off the porch and down the gravel before his brain caught up, boots slipping, breath tearing out of him in ragged clouds in the cold morning air. "Hey! Hey! Stop the truck!" The driver didn't hear him over the diesel engine. Mason pushed harder, lungs burning, 41 years old and out of shape, and terrified that 30 seconds would be the difference between getting his life back and losing it forever a second time. He caught the trailer at the end of the driveway right where it dipped onto the county road, and he slammed both hands against the steel siding hard enough to bruise. "Stop! Stop! The truck, please!" This time it worked. Brakes hissed. Metal groaned. The truck rocked to a halt in a cloud of dust, and the driver's door swung open. A big man in a faded ball cap, climbing down with his hands already up like he expected trouble. Whoa, buddy. You can't be running up on a truck like that. I need to see the last engine. The one on the end. Please." The driver, his name patch read. Duke looked at Mason like he'd lost his mind. Which, honestly, Mason wasn't entirely sure he hadn't. "Sir, I already dropped the load. Paperwork signed. You want to inspect scrap, you can do that back at your shop. I got 4 more stops." 2 minutes. Mason's voice cracked. He hated that it cracked. 2 minutes, that's all I'm asking. Something in his face must have said more than his words did, because Duke's shoulders dropped an inch, and he sighed the way men do when they've decided arguing isn't worth it. 2 minutes. Mason was already climbing onto the flatbed before Duke finished the sentence, his palms scraping against rust and cracked paint as he hauled himself up the side. He crawled past 5 engine blocks dead weight. Cracked housings, the kind of write-off that got shipped out to men like him to strip for parts and scrap for pennies until he reached the 6th. He wiped his sleeve across the casing. MR7. Still there. Not a trick of the light. Not his imagination running wild after years of quiet, forgotten failure. His own stamp. His own hands. A machine he hadn't touched in 12 years sitting on the back of a scrap truck like it was nothing. Mason pressed his palm flat against the cold metal, and for one humiliating second, standing on the back of a flatbed truck in front of a total stranger, he had to fight not to cry. "Sir," Duke called up. "You good up there?" Mason didn't answer right away. He was somewhere else. Somewhere 12 years gone. He remembered a lab with better lighting than his entire garage combined. He remembered a whiteboard covered in equations that took him 11 months to solve, and one afternoon for a room full of executives to applaud. He remembered a man named Richard Voss shaking his hand so hard it hurt, calling him the future of Hart Automotive, calling the Mark 7 project the most important thing the company had ever built. He remembered his wife Carol laughing at the dinner table because he couldn't stop talking about compression ratios even during her birthday dinner. He remembered thinking that for the first time in his life, Everything was finally going right. And he remembered the day it all came apart, not slowly, but all at once, like a wall collapsing. Test data that didn't match his own notes. A catastrophic failure during a demonstration that never should have happened, not with the safeguards he'd built in. A closed-door meeting he wasn't invited to. A termination letter with his name misspelled, like he mattered so little they couldn't even bother to get it right. And 6 months after that, Carol was gone too. Fast. Cruel. No warning at all. Mason had spent the next decade telling himself the engines didn't matter anymore. That none of it mattered anymore. That the only thing that mattered was the little girl he had to raise alone, and the only future worth thinking about was hers. He'd almost believed it. "Sir," Duke's voice gentler now. "You want me to give you a minute?" Mason climbed down slower than he'd climbed up, legs unsteady, jaw tight. These were supposed to be scrapped, he said, not a question. A statement he needed someone else to confirm, because his own memory felt too unreliable to trust right now. "Yes, sir. Disposal order came straight from corporate. Hart Automotive's cleaning out a warehouse, some old prototype line. Apparently none of it panned out. They're paying scrap yards and small shops all over 3 states to take the load off their hands. Guess your place was on the list." "Who signed the order?" Duke shrugged, already climbing back into the cab. "Don't know, don't care, honestly. I just drive. But if you're taking possession, I need a signature, and we're square. You want 'em or not? Because if not, next stop's the Crusher in Millbrook, and they don't ask questions." The Crusher. Mason looked at the 6 engines lined up behind him, rusted and broken, and dismissed by a company that once called this exact technology the future. "I want them," he said. "All 6. Lily was already up when he walked back into the house, sitting at the kitchen table in her school uniform, swinging her feet under her chair, a bowl of cereal going soft in front of her. "Dad, you look weird." "I look weird." "Like Grandpa's ghost story face, the one where you say it's not scary but your voice gets all quiet." Mason managed a small laugh, mostly for her. He sat down across from her hands, still shaking slightly, and tried to figure out how to explain something he barely understood himself. "Remember I told you Mommy and I used to work at a big car company before you were born? You said you built engines, like really good ones." "Yeah." His throat tightened. "I did. And then bad stuff happened and we moved here. 9 years old, and she already had the family history down to 2 sentences. Mason hated that. Hated that a kid her age had to summarize her own father's failure like it was just a fact of life, no different than the weather. "There's a truck outside," he said. "It brought 6 old engines, and I think they might be the ones I built back then." Lily blinked at him. "The really good ones." "Maybe." "So why'd they throw them away if they're really good?" Mason opened his mouth and closed it again, because the honest answer? "I don't know. Someone made sure the world thought they were failures, and I never found out who or why wasn't something a 9-year-old needed loaded onto her shoulders before the school bus came." "I don't know yet," he said instead, "but I'm going to find out." Lily studied him for a long moment, with the kind of seriousness only kids give you when they sense something matters, even if they can't name it. "You're gonna fix them," she said. It wasn't a question. "I'm gonna try." She nodded like that settled it, went back to her cereal, and said in the same breath, "Can we get a dog if you sell them?" Mason laughed for real this time, the first real laugh in longer than he wanted to admit, and something in his chest loosened just slightly. "We'll talk about the dog." By 10 that morning, half of Route 9 already knew a truck had dumped junk on Mason Reed's property, because in a town of 4,000 people, nothing moved faster than bad news dressed up as gossip. Earl Jenkins, who ran the feed store 2 lots down, wandered over with his thumbs hooked in his overalls and a grin that was already halfway to a laugh. "Heard the big city sent you their trash, Mason?" "Something like that. Company that size don't send junk to a shop like yours, less it really is junk." Earl peered past him at the flatbed still sitting in the yard, waiting on Mason to unload it himself, since Duke wasn't paid to do more than drop and drive. "What is it? Tractor parts, racing engines." Earl let out a low whistle, more mocking than impressed. Racing engines, right. And here I thought you were just gonna scrap 'em for parts like everybody figured. Maybe I will. Or maybe... Earl grinned wider, enjoying himself now. Maybe you're gonna rebuild 'em into some kind of supercar and show up them fancy folks in the city. That'd be something, wouldn't it? Mason didn't answer. He just kept staring at the engines like they might disappear if he looked away. Earl's laugh faded into something more like pity when he realized Mason wasn't joking back. Look, I ain't trying to rag on you, Mason. You're a good mechanic. Best in 3 counties probably. But you gotta know how this looks. Man loses everything. Spends 10 years fixing tractors and lawnmowers, and now he thinks 6 busted engines from a billion-dollar company are gonna be his big comeback. He shook his head, not unkindly. That's the kind of thing that gets a man's heart broke twice. Maybe. You always were stubborn. Earl clapped him on the shoulder anyway, the way men in small towns did when they cared about you, but didn't have the words for it. Holler if you need a hand unloading, and Mason... He paused halfway back to his truck. Don't let Lily see you chasing ghosts too hard. Kid needs her dad here, not stuck 12 years back. The words landed harder than Earl probably meant them to. Mason stood alone in the yard a long time after Earl left, staring at 6 engines the world had already decided were worthless, feeling the old familiar weight of being underestimated settle back onto his shoulders like a coat he'd never quite managed to take off. He didn't touch the first engine until after Lily was on the school bus. The garage was cold, the kind of cold that got into your knuckles and stayed there, but Mason barely noticed as he wheeled the engine hoist into position and began the slow, careful work of stripping the casing down. His hands remembered things his mind had tried hard to forget: the exact torque on every bolt, the specific angle you had to approach the intake manifold to avoid cracking the housing. Small details that should have faded after 12 years of tractors and lawnmowers and pickup trucks, but hadn't. It scared him a little, honestly, how much of it was still there. Like his hands had been waiting the entire time for permission to remember. 3 hours in sweat-soaked, despite the cold, he pulled the timing cover free and found something that stopped him cold. A folded scrap of paper, brittle with age, wedged into a gap behind the cover plate, where no factory inspection would ever think to look. Somewhere only the engine's original builder would know to hide something. Somewhere only Mason would know to hide something. His own hands had put it there. 12 years ago. He remembered now a habit he'd picked up early in his career, tucking a small note into the internals of anything he built a private signature nobody else knew about. Something Carol used to tease him for. Building love letters into engine blocks, Mason Reed. Only you. He unfolded it slowly, careful not to tear the fragile paper. His own handwriting. Younger, steadier. Test results logged April 12th. Compression variance outside spec, deliberate tampering, suspected in Bay 3 calibration. Reported to R. Voss, April 14th. No response. Mason sat down hard on the garage floor, the note trembling in his fingers. 12 years of quiet doubt suddenly given a name, a date, and a signature. He hadn't imagined it. He hadn't been paranoid or bitter or wrong. Someone had sabotaged his engines on purpose. And he'd told them. He'd told Richard Voss himself in writing weeks before everything fell apart, and nothing had ever come of it except his career ending and his name disappearing from a project that had once carried his signature into every gearbox, every cylinder, every quiet, hopeful hour he'd spent building something he believed could change the industry. He read the note 4 more times, like the words might rearrange themselves into something less true. They didn't. Mason folded the paper back up with hands that had finally stopped shaking, and for the first time in 12 years, the thing sitting in his chest wasn't grief. It was something closer to fire. He looked at the 5 remaining engines still waiting on the flatbed outside. Dead weight the world had thrown away without a second thought, and he said quietly to no one but himself and the empty garage, "You didn't erase me. You just buried me." He picked up his wrench, walked to the second engine, and got to work. The second engine came apart easier than the first, but what Mason found inside it hit harder. Wedged behind the crankshaft housing, taped in a spot no factory technician would ever think to check, was a small data card, the kind engineers use to log diagnostic readings straight off the test bench. Mason turned it over in his fingers, like it might crumble to dust, and for a second, he just stared at it, breathing hard, not sure if he wanted to know what was on it. He wanted to know. He'd wanted to know for 12 years. He didn't have the original equipment to read it. That hardware belonged to a lab he hadn't set foot in since the day security walked him out with a cardboard box under his arm, but he knew someone who might. His hands were already dialing before his brain caught up. "Pete, it's Mason." "Yeah, Mason Reed. Listen, I know it's early and I know we haven't talked in a while, but I need a favor and I need it to stay quiet." On the other end of the line, Pete Alvarez, who used to run diagnostics 2 labs down from Mason, back at Hart Automotive before he got out and opened his own electronics repair shop 3 towns over, went quiet for a second. "Mason Reed," Pete said slowly. "Man, I thought you dropped off the face of the earth." "Close to it. You need a favor after 12 years of nothing. That's a hell of an opener." "I know, I'm sorry. I'll explain everything. I promise. Just can you read an old diagnostic card for me?" Hart Automotive format, probably 11, 12 years old. There was a long pause, long enough that Mason thought the call had dropped. "Where'd you get a Hart diagnostic card, Mason?" "Found it. In an old engine block." Another pause, shorter this time, but heavier. "The Mark 7 blocks." Mason's chest tightened. "You knew about that. Everybody who was there back then knew something happened to you, man. Nobody knew what. Company shut it down so fast, so quiet, half of us figured you got fired for cause, and just didn't want to talk about it. The other half figured—" Pete trailed off. "Figured what?" "Figured you got screwed." Mason closed his eyes. 12 years, and somebody out there had believed him without ever saying a word. "Bring the card by tomorrow," Pete said, voice firmer now, like he'd made a decision. "I'll see what I can pull off it. And Mason, whatever's going on, be careful. Company like Hart doesn't bury a project that hard for no reason." He didn't sleep that night. Lily found him at 2 in the morning, sitting at the kitchen table with the second data card in front of him, untouched coffee gone cold at his elbow, staring at nothing. "Dad." Mason startled so hard he nearly knocked the mug over. "Lil, hey, what are you doing up?" "I heard you not sleeping." She climbed into the chair across from him, small and serious in her pajamas hair, a mess from tossing in bed. "You're doing the thing again." "What thing?" "The thing where your face looks like you're solving a math problem that doesn't have an answer." Mason huffed out something close to a laugh. 9 years old, and she read him better than most adults ever had. "I found something in one of the engines," he said. Because lying to her had never worked, not once. Not even when she was small enough that he thought she wouldn't understand. "A note. From me. From back then. It said somebody messed with my tests on purpose." Lily's eyes went wide. "Like cheated? Like sabotaged? On purpose? To make it look like I failed? Why would somebody do that?" Mason turned the data card over in his fingers. "I don't know yet, but I think whoever did it is the reason we ended up here. The reason I lost everything." Lily was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that made Mason worry he'd said too much, put too much weight on shoulders too small to carry it. Then she reached across the table and put her small hand over his. "Then you have to find out who," she said, dead serious the way only kids can be. "Because you're not a guy who fixes tractors, Dad. Grandma said you used to build things nobody else could build. I want everybody to know that too." Mason's throat closed up so fast he couldn't answer for a second. "Okay," he finally managed, voice rough. "Okay, I will." 3 states away, in the glass office on the top floor of Hart Automotive's headquarters, a man named Richard Voss was reviewing a routine disposal report when a single line made his coffee cup stop halfway to his mouth. MK7. Prototype units, 1 to 6. Disposal route, Reed Auto Repair, Route 9. Town name, redacted for narration. Voss set the cup down very slowly. He was 58 now, Silver at the temples, a corner office, and a company car, and a reputation as the steady hand who'd kept Hart Automotive's engineering division running clean for over a decade. Nobody in the building remembered or cared to remember that 12 years ago, he'd been a mid-level manager, desperate to keep his own name off a failing project before it sank his career along with it. He remembered. He remembered exactly whose name he'd needed gone from that project and exactly what he'd done to make it happen. Karen. His voice came out sharper than he meant it to over the intercom. Get me the disposal manifest for the old Mark 7 units, now please. His assistant's voice crackled back confused. The prototype scrap that went out weeks ago, sir, standard clearance. I know it went out. I want to know exactly where. A pause. It's already on the report on your desk, sir. Voss looked down at the name again. Reed Auto Repair. Reed. It was a common enough name. It had to be a coincidence. Mason Reed hadn't worked in this industry in over a decade. The man had vanished, disappeared into whatever small forgotten town men like that disappeared into after their careers ended. There was no reason, none at all, for those specific engines to have landed in that specific man's garage. Except Voss had learned a long time ago not to believe in coincidences that big. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. A private investigator the company kept on retainer for exactly this kind of quiet problem. I need you to look into someone for me, Voss said, keeping his voice level professional. The voice of a man handling a minor administrative headache and nothing more. Small-town repair shop. I want to know who owns it, what shape it's in, and whether the owners talked to anyone outside that town in the last week. Name. Voss looked at the report one more time at the 6 words that had just turned his entire day upside down. Mason Reed. Back on Route 9 morning came cold and gray, and Mason was already 3 hours into the third engine by the time Earl Jenkins wandered over again, coffee in hand, grinning like a man who'd come to enjoy watching a slow-motion disaster. Still at it, huh? Still at it. You look like hell, Mason. Feels about right. Earl leaned against the garage door frame, watching Mason work with the kind of skepticism that had followed him around town for 12 straight years. Not cruel exactly. Just tired the skepticism of people who'd watched a smart man fall hard once and didn't much believe in second acts. You know Deb over at the diner's already telling folks you've lost it, Earl said. Said you were up all night talking to yourself out here. I wasn't talking to myself. Then who were you talking to at 2 in the morning with the garage light on? Mason hesitated, wrench frozen mid-turn. He hadn't told anyone in town about the note yet, hadn't told anyone but Lily. Something about saying it out loud to a man like Earl, a good man, but not exactly built for keeping secrets, made him nervous. Just thinking, Mason said instead. Earl studied him a beat too long, like he didn't quite buy it, but let it go. Well, bank called the shop yesterday, by the way. Left a message on the machine, saw it blinking when I dropped off that carburetor. You might want to check it. Mason's stomach dropped. He already knew what it said before he even played it back. Thanks, Earl. You gonna be all right, man? And there it was underneath the teasing something real. Earl might have laughed at him plenty, but he'd also brought over casseroles the month after Carol died and taught Lily how to ride a bike when Mason was too broken to do it himself. Small towns were like that. Cruel and kind in the same breath sometimes from the same person. I'll be fine. You always say that. It's always been true so far. Earl didn't look convinced, but he clapped Mason on the shoulder anyway and headed back to the feed store, leaving Mason alone with 3 dead engines, 1 live wire of hope, and a voicemail he didn't want to hear. He played it anyway. This message is for Mason Reed regarding account ending in 4471. Your business loan payment is now 60 days past due. Please contact our office immediately to avoid further collection action, which may include liens against business property. Mason sat down on an overturned bucket and put his head in his hands. 60 days. He hadn't even realized it had gotten that far behind. Between Lily's school expenses and a slow month of tractor repairs and a leaking roof, He still hadn't been able to afford to fix the loan payment, had slipped further and further down a list of things he simply couldn't keep up with. If the bank called in the loan, they could put a lien on the shop. The shop was everything. It was the roof over Lily's head. It was the only thing standing between them and nothing at all. And here he was spending every spare hour chasing a 12-year-old ghost instead of fixing the actual immediate crisis in front of him. For one long, brutal minute, Mason almost believed Earl was right. Almost believed the whole town was right. That he was a grown man, wasting what little time and money he had left on a fantasy, while his daughter's future slipped away behind him. Then, he looked up at the 3 engines lined against the garage wall. MR7 stamped into every one of them, proof stamped in steel that he hadn't imagined his own life. He wiped his face, stood back up, and picked up the wrench again. "Not yet," he muttered to himself. "Not yet." 2 states away, the private investigator's report landed on Richard Voss's desk by 4 that afternoon, and what it said made him lock his office door for the first time in years. Mason Reed, 41. Widower, 1 daughter, age 9. Owner of a small independent repair shop on Route 9, current on most bills except a business loan, now 60 days delinquent. No known contact with anyone from Hart Automotive in over a decade. No known contact. Yet. Voss read the last line 3 times. Subject was observed retrieving materials from the disposed prototype units. Nature of materials unknown. His hands, he noticed distantly, had gone cold. 12 years ago, he'd made a choice. A cold, calculated, career-saving choice. And he'd made peace with it a long time ago by telling himself the same story every night, that Mason Reed's project had genuine flaws, that the tampered test data had only accelerated an outcome that would have happened eventually, anyway. That no real harm had been done because the man had simply moved on. Disappeared, become nobody. He'd built an entire decade of his career, his reputation, his corner office on the assumption that Mason Reed had stayed buried. If Mason had found something in those engines, if he'd found the tampering evidence, Voss had always suspected he'd hidden somewhere clever. Because that was exactly the kind of paranoid, meticulous thing the young engineer used to do back then. Everything Voss had built could come apart in a single afternoon. He picked up the phone. "I need those units retrieved," he said the moment his assistant picked up. "All 6, immediately." "Sir, the disposal's already been logged as complete, legally, once it's transferred." "I don't care about the paperwork. Send someone to buy them back. Cash offer, whatever it takes today. Tell them it's a recall issue, liability concerns. I want those engines out of that man's hands before end of day tomorrow." There was a pause on the line. "And sir, if he won't sell..." Voss looked out his window, at the city skyline, at everything he'd built on the bones of a decision he'd never let himself fully examine. "Everyone sells," he said quietly. "You just have to find the right price, or the right pressure." The man who showed up at Mason's shop the next morning didn't look like trouble. That was the thing that struck Mason later, thinking back on it, how ordinary he looked: khakis and a polo shirt with no logo, a clipboard, a friendly practice smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Mr. Reed, name's Carl Denning. I'm with an industrial recovery firm. We handle asset reclamation for a number of manufacturers." He extended a hand Mason didn't take. "I understand you recently took possession of some engine components from Hart Automotive." Mason's pulse kicked up hard and fast. "Word travels fast. It's our job to know where reclaimed materials end up." Denning's smile widened, still not reaching his eyes. "We're prepared to offer you a generous buyback. $15,000 cash today for all 6 units. No questions asked. $15,000 would clear the loan. $15,000 would fix the roof cover. Lily's expenses for a year, buy him breathing room he hadn't had in longer than he could remember. It also made absolutely no sense. "Scrap engines are worth a couple $100 apiece for parts," Mason said slowly, watching Denning's face for any flicker of a reaction. "You're offering $15,000 for junk your own company threw away last week. We see potential value your average scrapper might miss. Try again." Denning's smile finally slipped just for a second. just enough for Mason to see something colder underneath it. "Mr. Reed, I'd strongly encourage you to consider the offer. It's more money than those units are worth to anyone else on the planet, and frankly, holding on to discarded corporate property can create complications. Legal complications, the kind that get expensive fast for a man in your position." There it was, not an offer. A threat wrapped in a smile and a clipboard. Mason felt something shift in his chest. The same fire that had lit up 2 nights ago, staring at his own handwriting on a piece of paper 12 years old. "You know what?" Mason said slowly. "I don't think I caught who you actually work for." "I told you an independent recovery." "No." Mason took a step closer, close enough that Denning's easy smile faltered completely. "I mean, who sent you? Because a company doesn't offer $15,000 for scrap unless somebody's scared of what's inside it. So why don't you go back and tell whoever sent you that the engines aren't for sale? Not for 15,000. Not for 50. Not for any number you've got." Denning's jaw tightened. "You're making a mistake." "Maybe. It won't be my first." For a long moment, the two men just stared at each other, the threat hanging unspoken between them, thick as the cold morning air. Then Denning turned without another word, got into an unmarked sedan, parked at the end of the driveway, and drove off fast enough to kick up gravel behind him. Mason stood there a long time after the car disappeared, hands shaking, not from fear exactly, though there was plenty of that too, but from the sheer dizzying confirmation of it all. They wouldn't send a man with $15,000 in cash for junk, which meant it had never been junk at all, which meant somebody somewhere was very afraid of what Mason Reed might find. He called Pete that night, voice tight with everything he was trying to hold steady. "Someone showed up at my shop today trying to buy the engines back, cash, 15 grand, wouldn't say who they worked for." On the other end of the line, Pete went quiet in a way that told Mason everything he needed to know before Pete even said a word. "I finished reading that data card," Pete said finally. "And, Mason, I don't think you're gonna like it." "Tell me anyway." Pete let out a long breath. "The compression readings on the card don't match anything that would have happened naturally. Somebody manually altered calibration settings on Bay 3 twice, once 4 days before your final demo, once the morning of. Whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing. Knew exactly how to make a perfectly good engine look like it was failing under pressure without leaving an obvious trail." Mason closed his eyes, gripping the phone so tight his knuckles ached. "Who signed off on the calibration checks?" There was a pause, the sound of Pete flipping through old digital records, the kind that should have been wiped clean over a decade ago, but somehow miraculously hadn't been. "Richard Voss," Pete said. The name hit Mason like a physical blow. Richard Voss. The man who'd shaken his hand so hard it hurt, who'd called him the future of the company, who'd sat across the table from him in that final meeting, and said with what Mason had believed at the time was genuine regret, that the numbers simply didn't lie, that sometimes brilliant men build things that just don't work the way they hoped. The numbers had lied, because Richard Voss had made them lie. "He's still there," Mason said slowly. "Voss. He's still at the company." "More than still there," Pete said grimly. "He's senior VP of engineering now. Word is, he's next in line for chief operating officer. Man's basically running half the company at this point." Mason sat down hard on the garage floor, the data card trembling in his free hand. 12 years of grief and confusion, and quiet self-doubt, reorganizing itself into a single sharp, undeniable shape. He hadn't failed. He'd been erased. Deliberately. Precisely. By a man who'd built an entire career on the wreckage of Mason's own. And that same man had just sent someone to his shop with $15,000 in cash, trying to make the evidence disappear before Mason could ever put the pieces together. "Mason," Pete's voice careful now. "You still there?" "Yeah." Mason's voice came out steadier than he felt. "I'm here. Look, man, I gotta tell you, if what's on that card is true, and if this Denning guy really did show up trying to buy the engines back that fast, that's not nothing. That's a company scared enough to move money and muscle in less than 48 hours. You need to be careful. People who cover things up for 12 years don't usually stop just because somebody found a note. I know. I mean it, Mason. You've got a kid. Mason looked through the open garage door at the house beyond it, at the single lit window where Lily was almost certainly still awake, probably worrying about him the way she always did lately, carrying weight a 9-year-old should never have to carry. I know, he said again, quieter this time. That's exactly why I'm not stopping. 2 days later, the second big blow landed. Mason was in the middle of reassembling the third engine, hands deep in grease radio, playing low static in the background when his phone buzzed with a number he didn't recognize. He almost let it go to voicemail. Something told him to answer. Mr. Reed, this is First County Bank calling regarding your business loan. His stomach dropped straight through the floor. I'm current, he said quickly, though he knew that wasn't fully true. I mean, I'm behind. I know I'm behind, but I've never missed a payment before this. Mr. Reed, I understand, and normally we'd work with a long-standing customer on a payment plan. However, the woman on the other end hesitated, sounding almost apologetic. We received an unusual call this morning from a third party expressing concern about the collateral securing your loan. Specifically questions about ownership disputes over property stored at your business address. Mason's blood went cold. What third party? I'm not able to share that information, but given the concerns raised, our risk department has flagged your account for accelerated review. I'm sorry to say, we may need to call the loan in full within 30 days, unless the situation is resolved. Mason stood frozen in the middle of his garage, grease-stained wrench still in his hand. The third engine half-assembled behind him, and felt the entire fragile structure of his life tilt hard toward collapse. 30 days. 30 days to pay off a loan he could barely service on a normal month, or lose the shop. Lose the house. Lose everything. They hadn't just tried to buy the truth. When that failed, they'd gone straight for his legs. Please, Mason said, hating how raw his voice sounded, hating that a stranger on the phone was hearing him this close to breaking. Please, there has to be something. I truly am sorry, Mr. Reed. If you can bring the account current within the week, that would go a long way toward reversing the flag. I'd encourage you to explore every option available to you. The call ended. Mason stood in the silence of the garage for a long time, staring at 3 half-rebuilt engines that had cost him in the space of 4 days almost everything he had left to lose. He didn't tell Lily that night. Couldn't. Instead, he sat across from her at dinner, pushing food around his plate, trying to smile in all the right places, while she talked about a science project on volcanoes, and felt like the worst father alive for not being able to promise her the roof over her head would still be there in a month. After she went to bed, he sat alone at the kitchen table with a legal pad doing math that refused to add up, no matter how many times he ran the numbers. Selling the shop's equipment wouldn't cover it. A second job wouldn't move fast enough. There was no version of this that ended with him keeping both the house and the truth, unless the engines themselves were worth something. Unless he could actually finish what he'd started faster than anyone would believe possible, and prove undeniably publicly that the Mark 7 project had never been a failure at all. It was a long shot. A desperate, reckless, 12 years too late long shot. It was also the only shot he had. Mason pushed back from the table, walked out to the cold garage under a sky full of more stars than the city ever let you see, and looked at the 6 engines lined up against the wall. 3 rebuilt, 3 still waiting. MR7 stamped into every casing, like a signature the world had tried and failed to erase. All right, he said quietly, rolling up his sleeves. Let's finish this. He worked through this night. By 4 in the morning, the 4th engine's casing was open, and what he found inside it stopped him cold all over again. Not a note this time, not a data card, but a small laminated photograph tucked into a hidden compartment behind the oil pan. Carol, smiling. 8 months pregnant, with Lily standing in the old lab, one hand resting on an early prototype block, looking at the camera with the kind of pure, unguarded joy Mason hadn't let himself remember in years. On the back, in his own handwriting, 12 years faded, but still legible. For when I forget why I'm doing this. Mason sat on the cold garage floor and cried for the first time in years. Not from grief this time, but from something fiercer, something that felt almost like being handed his own life back, piece by piece, engine by engine, exactly when he needed it most. He wiped his face, tucked the photograph carefully into his shirt pocket, close to his heart, and picked the wrench back up. Somewhere out there, Richard Voss was still trying to bury a truth 12 years in the ground. He had no idea the ground was already starting to shift beneath him. Morning came fast and hard, the kind of gray dawn where the cold seeps in before the light does. And Mason was still on the garage floor when his phone buzzed against the concrete beside him. He didn't recognize the number. Out-of-state area code. His first instinct was to let it ring out. He'd had enough of unfamiliar numbers this week to last a lifetime, but something made him pick up anyway. Mason Reed. Who's asking? My name is Evelyn Hart. A pause like she expected the name to land harder than it did. I'm the CEO of Hart Automotive. Mason sat up straight so fast his back cracked. For a second, he genuinely thought he'd misheard her, that exhaustion had finally caught up with him, and started scrambling words in his ear. I'm sorry, the CEO. That's right. I think you've got the wrong number. I work on tractors. I don't think I do, Mr. Reed. Her voice was calm, precise. The voice of someone used to being underestimated in every room she walked into and having long since stopped caring. 6 prototype engines from a project called Mark 7 were disposed of to your address 2 weeks ago. Yesterday, someone from a company I have never authorized attempted to buy those engines back from you for $15,000 in cash. This morning, my legal department received an unusual, unsolicited call from First County Bank's risk department referencing a business loan tied to your name. I don't believe in that many coincidences happening around one small repair shop in 1 week, Mr. Reed. Do you? Mason's mouth went dry. No, he said slowly. I don't. Good. Then we agree on something already. A short pause, and when she spoke again, her voice had shifted sharper, more direct. I'd like to see the engines, in person, today if possible. Why? Because 6 months ago, I inherited a company from my father that I am still learning to run, Mr. Reed. And in that time, I've discovered that a great many decisions were made before I ever sat in that chair. Decisions I'm only now finding out the real reasons behind. Someone in my own company tried to make a set of scrapped prototypes disappear within 48 hours of them landing at your shop. I want to know why badly enough that I've already had my assistant book a flight. Mason stood up slowly, grease still drying on his hands, 12 years of quiet disbelief crashing directly into this strange, impossible morning. You're coming here today. I land at 2. I'll be at your shop by 4. Another pause, and this time something almost gentler slipped into her voice. Mr. Reed, whatever happened to you at my company 12 years ago, I don't know the full story yet, but I intend to. I'd like to hear your side of it before anyone else has the chance to shape mine. The line went dead before Mason could answer. He stood in the middle of his garage phone still pressed to his ear, staring at 6 engines that a week ago the world had called worthless, and felt the ground under his entire life tilt for the second time in 4 days. He called Pete the second he hung up, pacing the length of the garage so fast he nearly tripped over an air compressor hose. She's coming here. Today. Evelyn Hart herself. The CEO? Pete's voice cracked with disbelief. The actual CEO is flying to your garage. That's what she said. Mason, that's either the best thing that's happened to you in 12 years, or it's a trap. You understand that, right? You just told me 2 days ago that somebody inside that company sent a man with 15 grand in cash to make you disappear quietly. Now suddenly the CEO herself is flying out personally. That doesn't smell right to me. Mason stopped pacing, chest tight. You think she's in on it. I think I don't know her from Adam, and neither do you. And 12 years ago you trusted people at that company who smiled at you right before they buried your whole career. I'm just saying, watch yourself. Mason looked down at his hands, still stained with a decade of honest forgotten work, and thought about Richard Voss's handshake all those years ago, warm and firm and utterly meaningless. I hear you, he said quietly. But Pete, What choice do I have? I've got 30 days before the bank calls in my loan. I've got 6 engines and a note and a data card. And nobody in this town who believes any of it means anything. If there's even a chance she's telling the truth, I have to take it. Pete sighed long and heavy, the sound of a man who'd rather argue, but knew better. Then at least send me photos of everything before she gets there. The note, the data card, all of it. Somebody outside that house needs to know what you've got just in case. Why just in case? Because companies that bury things for 12 years, Mason don't usually stop burying just because somebody finally showed up asking the right questions. Mason spent the next 4 hours doing something he hadn't done in 12 years, laying out his own work like it mattered. He cleared off the long workbench, wiped down every surface twice, and arranged the 2 rebuilt engines side by side where the afternoon light would hit them best. He photographed the note and the data card and texted them to Pete exactly like he'd promised. Then sat at the kitchen table and read the note one more time, memorizing every word, so he wouldn't stumble over a single detail if when someone finally asked him to explain. Lily came home from school to find him in a clean shirt, hair-combed, nervous energy radiating off him so strong she noticed it from the driveway. "Dad, why are you dressed like church?" "Someone important is coming by." "Who?" Mason hesitated, weighing how much to tell a 9-year-old about billionaires and sabotage and buried careers, then decided, like always, that the truth was easier than any version he could invent. "The lady who owns the company that made those engines," he said. "The one whose name is on the papers." Lily's eyes went enormous. "Like she's rich. "I think so, yeah." "Is she coming to yell at you?" "I don't think so. I think she's coming because she wants to understand what really happened, to me, back then." Lily considered this with the total seriousness she brought to everything, swinging her backpack slowly off one shoulder. "Are you scared?" Mason almost lied. Almost gave her the easy answer, the one that would let her go do her homework without worrying about her father one more time this week. "A little," he admitted instead. "But I think being scared and doing it anyway is kind of the whole point." Lily nodded slowly, like she was filing that away somewhere important. And then, because she was 9, and the world still occasionally let her be 9, she asked, "Can I meet her?" "The rich lady." Mason laughed, despite everything sitting heavy in his chest. "We'll see." At exactly 4 o'clock, a black SUV that looked wildly out of place on the gravel of Route 9 pulled into Mason's driveway, and Evelyn Hart stepped out before the driver had even fully parked. She wasn't what Mason expected. He'd built some vague picture in his head of a polished, distant executive, all expensive suits and colder-than-ice detachment, the kind of person who visited small towns the way tourists visited zoos. Instead, the woman walking toward him was younger than he'd pictured, maybe mid-30s, dressed plainly enough that she could have passed for anyone, dark circles under sharp, tired eyes that told Mason she hadn't slept much better than he had lately. "Mr. Reed." She extended her hand, and unlike Denning's practiced grip, hers was firm, direct, no performance in it at all. "Thank you for seeing me on short notice." "You didn't exactly give me a choice." A small, tired smile flickered across her face. "Fair enough." She followed him into the garage, and Mason watched her carefully as she took in the 2 rebuilt engines sitting on the workbench, watched her expression shift from polite professional interest to something much sharper, much more focused, the moment her eyes landed on the MR7 stamp pressed into the casing. "That's your mark," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Mason's stomach flipped. "How would you know that?" "Because I spent the last 2 days going through personnel records my own legal team apparently didn't want me looking at very closely." Evelyn stepped closer, running her fingers just above the stamp without touching it, like she was afraid it might disappear if she did. "Mason Reed, lead engineer, Mark 7 prototype program. Terminated 12 years ago for, and I'm quoting the file directly, catastrophic performance failures resulting from engineering error." Mason's jaw tightened. "That's what they told me too, right before they walked me out." "I don't believe it." She said it simply, without dramatics, like a fact she'd already settled in her own head before ever getting on the plane. I've had 3 separate engineers on my current team review what little documentation survived from that project over the last 48 hours. Every one of them said the same thing: the design fundamentals were sound. Ahead of their time, actually. There was no reason for that program to fail the way the official record claims it did. Mason's throat tightened so hard, he had to look away for a second. Out through the open garage door, toward the driveway, toward Lily's face, pressed curiously against the living room window. "I have proof," he said finally, voice rougher than he meant it to be, "that it didn't fail on its own." Evelyn went very still. "Show me." He laid it all out on the workbench, the note brittle and folded, hidden behind a timing cover for 12 years. The data card Pete had spent 2 nights decoding. Even the photograph of Carol, though he kept that one in his pocket, too raw to share with a stranger just yet. Even one who might hold his entire future in her hands. Evelyn read the note twice, her expression darkening with every line. "Deliberate tampering suspected in Bay 3 calibration," she read aloud. Quiet, controlled fury building underneath every word. "Reported to R. Voss. No response." "Richard Voss," Mason said. "He was my manager back then. Senior VP now, from what I hear." Evelyn's head snapped up. "Chief Operating Officer as of 8 months ago. I promoted him myself 6 weeks into my father's illness because he was the most senior engineering executive left. And she stopped jaw tight, because I trusted him. Because everyone told me to trust him." "You didn't know." "No, I didn't." Her voice had gone hard now, cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature in the garage. "But I intend to find out exactly how deep this goes, Mr. Reed, and I need your help doing it. Because right now, all I have is a hunch and a suspicious buyback offer. What you have," she gestured at the note, "the data card, is evidence." Mason looked at the 6 engines around them, 3 still waiting to be touched, and felt something he hadn't let himself feel in 12 long years. Hope. Real, dangerous, terrifying hope. "There's something else," he said slowly. 2 days ago, a man named Carl Denning showed up here trying to buy the engines back. 15,000 cash, no questions asked. When I turned him down, he threatened me, said holding on to them would create complications. Legal complications. Evelyn's face went pale, then hard. "And the bank called you the next day." "How'd you know that?" "Because that's not a coincidence, Mr. Reed. That's a pattern. Someone panicked the moment those engines left the warehouse, and they've been trying to make the problem disappear ever since, first with money, then with pressure." She pulled out her phone fingers, already moving. "I want copies of everything. The note, the data card, the buyback offer, the bank. Call all of it dated and documented. And I want to know exactly what Denning's company is, because I guarantee you it traces back to someone inside my own building." Mason watched her work sharp and fast and utterly unlike anyone he'd dealt with in this industry in over a decade, and felt something loosen in his chest for the first time since the truck first pulled into his driveway. "Why are you doing this?" he asked quietly. "You could have just let it go. Nobody would have known." Evelyn looked up from her phone, and for a second, the hard, controlled executive expression slipped, revealing something younger and more tired underneath. "My father built this company on the idea that good engineering matters more than politics," she said. "I watched him get sicker every year. Watched people I trusted circle him like vultures the moment they thought I wasn't paying attention. If Richard Voss destroyed a man's career and buried his invention to protect himself, then he's exactly the kind of person my father spent his whole life trying to keep out of leadership. I'm not doing this for you, Mr. Reed. Not only for you, anyway." She held his gaze steady. "I'm doing it because if I let this slide, I'm no better than the people who let it happen the first time." They were still going over the data card together when Mason's phone buzzed with a text from Pete, 3 words that made his stomach drop straight through the floor. "Check the news. Now." Mason pulled it up with shaking hands. And there it was, a small regional business article, already picking up traction, headline blunt and ugly. "Local mechanic under investigation for theft of corporate property, sources allege." Mason's blood turned to ice. He scanned the article fast, hands trembling, and felt each sentence land like a physical blow. Anonymous sources within Hart Automotive alleging the disposal had been processed in error. Claims that Mason Reed had refused legitimate attempts to return improperly transferred corporate assets. A quote unattributed careful deniable suggesting the mechanic in question had a history of erratic behavior following his termination 12 years prior. "They're trying to discredit me," Mason said, voice tight with disbelief, "before I even get a chance to say anything." Evelyn grabbed the phone out of his hand, eyes scanning fast, and her expression went from concerned to genuinely furious in the space of about 3 seconds. "This came from inside my own communications department," she said, low and dangerous. "Nobody plants a story like this without someone senior authorizing it." She was already dialing before she finished the sentence. "Karen, pull every media contact who's touched this story in the last hour. I want to know who fed it to them, and I want it traced back before end of day." Mason sat down hard, the article still glowing on the screen. 12 years of quiet, forgotten obscurity suddenly replaced with the horrifying sensation of being publicly falsely accused in front of anyone with an internet connection. "They're not just trying to bury the past anymore," he said quietly. "They're trying to bury me before anyone believes a word I say." Evelyn's hand landed on his shoulder, firm and steadying. "Then we move faster than they do." That night, after Evelyn left with a promise to return the next morning with a company lawyer, and her words grim and determined, someone who's going to have a very uncomfortable conversation with Richard Voss. Mason sat at the kitchen table staring at his phone, watching the article's share count climb in real time, feeling sicker with every refresh. Lily found him there again, same as before, small and quiet in her pajamas. "Dad, why do people online think you stole something?" His stomach dropped. "You saw that Cody's mom showed my teacher. Everybody was kind of looking at me weird at pickup." Her voice wobbled just slightly, and Mason felt that crack straight through his own chest. "Is it true?" "No." He said it fast, firm, no hesitation at all. "No, baby. I promise you none of it's true. Those engines are mine. I built them. Somebody at that company is trying to make it look like I did something wrong because they're scared of what happens if the truth comes out instead." Lily studied him with those same too serious eyes she always gave him lately. "The truth that you're actually really good at this. Like genius, good." Mason let out a breath that was half laugh, half exhausted disbelief. "Something like that." "Then why don't people just believe you?" "Because it's easier to believe a story you're handed than to go find out the real one," Mason said quietly. "Grown-ups aren't always as smart as they look, Lil." She climbed into his lap, too big for it really, all elbows and knees, but he held on anyway, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. "I believe you," she said finally into his shoulder. "I've always believed you." Mason closed his eyes, throat too tight to answer, and just held his daughter a little tighter. 2 towns away, in an office that suddenly felt far less secure than it had a week ago, Richard Voss stared at his own phone, watching the story he'd carefully, quietly authorized start generating exactly the kind of public sympathy backlash he hadn't anticipated at all. Comments were pouring in, not condemning Mason Reed, but questioning the company, questioning why a billion-dollar corporation would go to such lengths to discredit a small-town mechanic over a handful of scrapped engines. Someone had already dug up Mason's old employment dates and started asking publicly, pointedly, why an award-winning engineer had vanished so completely, so fast, so quietly 12 years ago. His phone buzzed. Evelyn Hart's name on the screen. He almost didn't answer. Almost let it ring out and bought himself one more night to think. But avoiding her would look worse than facing her, and Voss had built an entire career on knowing exactly which risk to take at exactly the right moment. "Evelyn, I was just about to call you about this ridiculous story." "Don't." Her voice was ice sharper than he'd ever heard it. "Don't you dare pretend you're calling to help clean this up, Richard, because I already know it came from inside communications, and I already know who has the authority to greenlight a story like that without my sign-off." Voss's stomach dropped, but he kept his voice level. practiced calm. "Evelyn, I understand you're upset, but you have to think about the optics here. A former employee terminated for cause is now claiming terminated for cause based on what, Richard? Because I've spent the last 2 days going through everything that survived from the Mark 7 program, and there is a data card sitting on my desk right now showing manual calibration tampering on Bay 3, signed off under your authority, dated 4 days, and again, the morning of the demonstration that ended Mason Reed's career." Silence stretched long and heavy on the line. "I don't know what you're talking about," Voss said finally, too fast, too tight. "I think you do." Evelyn's voice dropped quiet and lethal in a way that scared him far more than shouting would have. "I think you've known exactly what you did for 12 years, Richard. And I think you're about to find out that burying the truth once doesn't mean it stays buried forever." The line went dead. Voss sat alone in his office a long time after that, staring at the city lights beyond his window, feeling for the first time in over a decade the cold creeping certainty that the ground he'd built his entire career on was finally irreversibly starting to crack. By morning, the story had grown legs Mason never could have predicted. A local news van was parked at the end of his driveway when he stepped outside with his coffee, and for one panicked second, his instinct was to retreat straight back into the house. Then he saw the reporter's face, not hostile, not hunting for a scandal, but genuinely curious, notebook in hand, camera operator hanging back respectfully. "Mr. Reed, I'm Sarah Coleman, Channel 9. I know you're probably not eager to talk to press right now, but I wanted to give you the chance to tell your side before this story runs away from you completely." Mason hesitated, coffee mug halfway to his mouth. 12 years of quiet obscurity, screaming at him to shut the door and disappear back inside. Then he thought about Lily, about kids looking at her strangely at pickup, about a story built entirely on someone else's lie, and something in him hardened instead. "Give me 5 minutes," he said. "Then I'll tell you everything." The interview ran that evening longer and more sympathetic than Mason had any right to expect. He talked about the Mark 7 project, about the note hidden in the timing cover, about the data card showing deliberate tampering, about a data-driven career-ending failure that had never actually been a failure at all. He didn't mention Voss by name. Evelyn had asked him carefully to hold that detail back for now, until the company's internal investigation could move forward properly. But he didn't need to. The pieces were already assembling themselves in the public imagination, and by the time the segment ended, the comment section beneath it had flipped entirely, sympathy pouring toward the mechanic in the small garage, and away from the billion-dollar company that seemed increasingly desperate to bury him. Even Earl showed up the next morning, hat in hand, looking genuinely sheepish for the first time in 12 years of knowing Mason. "Saw you on the news last night," Earl said, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Heard the whole thing. About the sabotage, the tampering, all of it." Mason kept working wary. And I feel like an ass Mason, if I'm honest." Earl scratched the back of his neck, uncomfortable in a way that didn't come naturally to him. 12 years I've been ribbing you about fixing tractors like it was all you were good for. Never once asked what actually happened to you back then. Just figured you screwed up somehow, same as everybody else figured." He looked at the engines lined up along the wall, 3 finished now, gleaming under the shop lights in a way scrap metal never should. "Turns out you were the smartest guy in this whole county the entire time, and none of us ever bothered to find out." Mason set down his wrench, something loosening in his chest that had been tight for longer than he could remember. "You didn't know Earl. Nobody did. That was kind of the whole point of what they did to me." "Well?" Earl cleared his throat, embarrassed. "For what it's worth, whatever you need whenever you need it, you got it. Whole town's talking different about you now. Deb over at the diner's already telling folks she always knew you had it in you." He grinned, some of the old teasing creeping back in gentler now. "Funny how fast folks remember believing in you the second it stops costing them anything." Mason laughed, a real one, tired but genuine, and for the first time in 12 long years, it didn't feel like laughing at his own expense. That afternoon, Evelyn arrived with a company lawyer trailing behind her, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Diane, who barely said a word before pulling out a stack of documents and getting straight to business. "We've suspended Richard Voss pending internal investigation," Evelyn said without preamble the moment she stepped into the garage. "Effective this morning." The board pushed back hard, but the data card evidence combined with the buyback attempt was more than enough to justify it. Mason felt something in his chest release that he hadn't even realized he'd been holding for 12 straight years. Just like that. Not just like that. Diane cut in businesslike, but not unkind. "This is the beginning of a formal process, not the end of one. But Mr. Reed, I want to be direct with you what you've assembled here. The note, the data card, the pattern of suppression that followed once those engines left the warehouse. It's substantial, more than substantial. If this holds up under formal review, and I believe it will, you're looking at a wrongful termination claim with real teeth on top of full public credit restoration for the Mark 7 program." Evelyn stepped closer, studying the 3 rebuilt engines with something that looked for the first time since Mason had met her almost like genuine excitement instead of grim determination. "There's something else," she said. "I had my engineering team run performance simulations based on your original specs, cross-referenced against the 2 units you've already rebuilt." "Mr. Reed." She looked up at him, and there was something almost reverent in her voice now. "These numbers are extraordinary. If the remaining 4 engines perform anywhere close to what we're projecting, this isn't just a wrongful termination story anymore. This is the most significant engine platform this company has developed in a decade, sitting in a garage on Route 912, years after somebody tried to bury it in a scrapyard." Mason looked at the 6 engines. 3 finished, 3 still waiting, MR7 stamped into every one of them like a signature the world had finally started to read correctly. "I want to finish them properly," he said quietly. "Not rushed, not for a headline. I want to build them the way I always meant to build them 12 years ago, before anyone got in the way." Evelyn nodded slowly, something like respect settling into her expression. "Then let's give you what you need to do exactly that." That night after everyone had gone, Mason sat alone in the garage with the photograph of Carol propped against a toolbox, watching the light catch the polished casing of the 2 finished engines, and let himself feel just for a moment something he hadn't dared feel in 12 long years. Not just hope. Vindication. His phone buzzed. A text from Pete saw the interview. "Proud of you, man. Really proud." Another buzz, this one from a number he didn't recognize, and his stomach tightened instinctively before he even opened it. "This isn't over, Mr. Reed. You have no idea what you've just started. No name, no signature. Just 6 words hanging in the dark, cold garage. Air a warning from someone who clearly hadn't finished fighting yet." Mason stared at the message a long time. Heart-pounding 12 years of hard-won peace, suddenly feeling very fragile. Then he looked at the photograph of Carol at Lily's bedroom light, still glowing warm through the kitchen window. At 4 engines, still waiting to be finished, and felt the old fire settle back into his chest. Steadier now, harder to shake. "No," he said quietly to the empty garage, to the anonymous threat glowing on his phone screen, to 12 years of buried truth finally clawing its way back into the light. "It's really not." He picked up his wrench, walked to the 4th engine, and got back to work. The message sat there glowing on Mason's phone for a long time before he finally put it face down on the workbench and made himself breathe. "This isn't over, Mr. Reed. You have no idea what you've just started. No name. No number he recognized. Just 6 words designed to do exactly what they were doing, crawl under his skin, and sit there cold and heavy while he tried to focus on torque specs and gasket seals, like his hands weren't shaking. He texted Evelyn first, then Pete. Both replies came back within minutes, both saying some version of the same thing: screenshot, it, don't respond, don't engage. Let the lawyers handle it. Sound advice. Advice Mason knew he should follow. He didn't sleep well anyway. Around 2 in the morning, a sound outside the garage jolted him upright on the couch where he'd been dozing with one eye half open. Some instinct refusing to let him actually go to bed while that message sat unanswered in his phone. Gravel shifting under weight that wasn't his own. A car door closed too carefully, like someone trying not to be heard. Mason was up and moving before he'd fully processed what he was doing, grabbing the heaviest wrench off the bench and easing the garage's side door open a crack. A figure was crouched near the flatbed where the last two unrebuilt engines still sat, waiting, flashlight beam small and focused, moving with the kind of practiced efficiency that told Mason immediately this wasn't some bored local kid messing around. "Hey!" The figure bolted. The second Mason's voice cracked through the dark. Mason ran after him 3 steps, adrenaline screaming through every nerve, before common sense finally caught up and stopped him. Cold. Chasing a stranger into the dark at 2 in the morning, alone with Lily asleep in the house behind him, was exactly the kind of decision that got men killed in movies and real life both. He watched instead as a car peeled out from the tree line down the road, headlights off until it hit the county road, gone before Mason could even get close enough to make out a plate number. His hands were shaking hard by the time he got back to the flatbed, running his light over the 2 remaining engines with a fear so sharp it nearly made him sick. Both engines were untouched. Whoever it was hadn't gotten to them yet, but zip-tied to the underside of the flatbed, where Mason never would have found it if he hadn't been running his hands along every inch checking for damage, was a small black device the size of a deck of cards. He didn't touch it. He photographed it from every angle, hands still trembling, and sent the picture straight to Pete with a message that barely held together. "Someone was just here. Found this attached to the truck." Pete's response came back in under a minute. "That's a tracker, Mason. GPS tracker. Someone's been monitoring the truck's movement, which means they know exactly where those engines have been every single second since they left the warehouse." Mason sat down hard on the cold gravel, staring at the small black device in the beam of his flashlight, and felt the fear in his chest curdle into something colder and more focused. They hadn't just tried to buy him off. They'd been watching, probably since the very first day. He called Evelyn at 6 that morning, unable to wait any longer, voice still rough with exhaustion and adrenaline that hadn't fully drained out of him yet. "Someone was on my property last night," he said, no preamble, straight into it. "They ran when I caught them. Found a GPS tracker attached to the flatbed." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Are you hurt?" "Is Lily?" "We're fine. She was asleep the whole time, never even woke up." Mason rubbed a hand over his face, exhausted in a way sleep wasn't going to fix. "But Evelyn, this isn't corporate pressure anymore. Someone's out here in the dark trying to get near these engines. That's not a lawyer's move." "No," Evelyn said grimly. "It's not." A pause, and Mason could hear her moving, could hear the particular quality of urgency in the sound of a door closing, a car starting. "I'm coming out. Today. And I'm bringing security with me this time, real security, not corporate suits. I should have done that the first day." "Evelyn, I don't want. This isn't a discussion, Mr. Reed." Her voice had gone hard protective in a way that surprised him. "You have a 9-year-old daughter in that house. I am not letting my company's mess put her in danger while I sit in a boardroom debating optics. I'll be there by noon." The line went dead, and Mason sat in his kitchen with the tracker's photograph still glowing on his phone screen, listening to the sound of Lily's alarm going off down the hall, and felt a fresh wave of fear hit him. Not for himself this time, but for her. He walked her to the bus stop himself that morning, instead of letting her go alone like usual, watching the road in both directions the whole time, and told himself he was being paranoid, even as every instinct in his body insisted otherwise. "Dad, you're being weird again," Lily said, eyeing him sideways as the bus pulled up. "Weirder than usual weird. Just want to see you off, that's all." "Is this about the truck thing I heard you on the phone?" Mason's stomach dropped. "You weren't supposed to hear that." "I hear everything, Dad. I'm a kid, not deaf." She studied him with that same, too serious expression, backpack straps twisted in her small hands. "Am I gonna be okay?" And there it was, the question he'd been dreading since the moment he found that tracker, the one that cut straight through every attempt he'd made to keep this whole mess contained to himself. "Yes?" Mason said, crouching down to her eye level, putting every bit of certainty he could fake into his voice, even though his own hands were still unsteady. "Yes, baby, I promise you. Whatever happens with all this, you are always going to be okay. That's the one thing I will never let anybody take from us. Ever." Lily nodded slowly, searching his face for the truth behind the words, and whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her enough to climb onto the bus without further argument. Mason stood at the end of the driveway, long after it pulled away, watching the road, hands clenched into fists at his sides, and made himself a silent promise standing right there in the cold morning air. Whatever this cost him, it wasn't going to cost him her safety. Not while he had breath left to fight for it. Evelyn arrived just after noon, exactly as promised, two serious-looking men in plain clothes, trailing a respectful distance behind her private security. She explained briskly, until things settled down. Mason didn't argue. After last night, he was grateful for it, in a way that surprised him. A small crack in the fierce independence that had carried him through 12 years alone. "I want to show you something," Evelyn said the moment the introductions were done, pulling out a tablet before she'd even fully stepped into the garage. "My legal team traced the buyback company, Denning's firm. It's a shell. Registered 18 months ago, single client on the books, funded entirely through a private account that doesn't trace back to Hart Automotive on paper anywhere." "Then how do you know it's connected to Voss?" "Because the account funding it was opened by a woman named Rita Calloway." Evelyn's jaw tightened. Voss's executive assistant. 15 years. She doesn't open personal shell company accounts on a whim someone told her to, and there's only one person at that company with the authority and the motive to ask her. Mason felt something settle in his chest, cold and certain. So he's covering his tracks, fast. Faster than I expected, honestly. Evelyn set the tablet down, expression grim. "Which tells me he's more scared than he's letting the board see. Panic makes people sloppy, Mr. Reed. That's actually good news for us, as strange as that sounds. Doesn't feel like good news when someone's sneaking around my property at 2 in the morning." "No," Evelyn admitted quietly. "I imagine it doesn't." She walked the length of the garage, slowly studying the 4 rebuilt engines now lined against the wall. Mason had finished the 4th just past midnight, working through his fear rather than letting it stop him. Hands steady, even when his mind wasn't, and something in her expression shifted, softened the sharp corporate focus, giving way to something more personal. "You know," she said, quiet enough that it felt almost like she was talking to herself as much as to him. "My father used to say the measure of an engineer wasn't how smart they were. It was whether they kept building even after the world told them to stop." She looked at Mason directly, something raw in her eyes now. "I think he would have liked you, Mr. Reed. I think he would have been furious about what happened to you." Mason didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing at all, just nodded, throat too tight for words. "There's something else." Evelyn continued businesslike again, pulling herself back into focus. "My team found a former employee, David Chen. He worked directly under Voss during the Mark 7 testing period, ran the calibration equipment in Bay 3 himself back then." Mason's head came up sharp. "You found him. He left the company 8 years ago. Moved out of state works and agricultural equipment, now keeps a low profile. My investigator reached him yesterday." Evelyn's expression turned careful, measured. "He wouldn't talk on the phone. Said it wasn't a conversation for phones. But he agreed to meet in person somewhere neutral. He said, and I'm quoting directly, 'Tell Mason Reed I've been waiting 12 years for someone to finally ask me the right question.'" Mason's breath caught hard in his chest. "He knows," he said slowly. "He knows what happened." "I think he does more than know, Mr. Reed." Evelyn's voice dropped grave. "I think he might be the one who actually flipped those calibration settings. And I think he's spent 12 years carrying that guilt around, waiting for someone to give him a reason to finally set it down." They drove out to meet David Chen 2 days later at a diner just off the interstate neutral ground, chosen carefully by a man who'd clearly spent a long time thinking about exactly how careful he needed to be. Chen was younger than Mason expected, mid-40s, tired eyes, hands that wouldn't stop turning his coffee cup in slow, anxious circles the entire time they talked. He looked, Mason thought, like a man who hadn't slept easy in over a decade. "I've thought about calling you 100 times, Chen said, not meeting Mason's eyes at first, voice low and rough. Every year around the anniversary of your termination, actually. I'd get halfway through dialing and then I'd just stop. Told myself it wouldn't change anything. Told myself you'd probably moved on, built a new life, didn't need some stranger dragging up ancient history. I never moved on, Mason said quietly. Not really. Chen's jaw tightened, guilt written plain across his face. Voss came to me 4 days before your final demonstration. He said, finally, the words coming out fast now, like he'd been holding them behind a dam for 12 years, and the dam had finally cracked. Told me there were concerns about the project timeline budget overruns, that corporate wanted contingencies in place, in case the demo didn't go as planned. Told me to adjust Bay 3's calibration by a specific margin, small enough that it wouldn't look intentional, but enough that it would show up under stress testing during the live demo. Did he tell you why? Evelyn asked, voice tight controlled. He told me it was about protecting the department's budget. Said if the numbers came in too good, corporate would ask why the project had run so far over cost for something that easy to build, and heads would roll, his included, probably mine too, for approving the spend in the first place. Chen finally looked up straight at Mason, eyes wet. I believed him. God help me, I believed every word of it. I thought I was protecting people's jobs. I thought I was protecting yours too. Honestly figured a minor hiccup in the demo would just mean an extra funding round, more time to refine things. I had no idea he was going to use it to end your entire career. Mason sat very still, hands flat on the table, 12 years of quiet, unanswered grief, finally getting a name and a face and a reason. After the demo failed, Chen continued, voice cracking now. And they walked you out that same week. I went to Voss's office. Told him I didn't understand, that this wasn't what he'd promised me would happen. And he looked me dead in the eye and told me if I ever said a word about the calibration to anyone, ever, he'd make sure it was my career that ended instead of just my conscience being uncomfortable. Chen wiped his face roughly with the back of his hand. I had 2 kids in daycare and a mortgage I couldn't afford to lose. I was scared. I stayed quiet. And I've hated myself every single day since. The diner was silent for a long moment, just the hum of the refrigerator case and someone's radio playing low behind the counter. I'm not asking you to forgive me, Chen said, finally, quiet and raw. I don't think I deserve that. But I'll testify. Whatever you need, written statement, deposition in front of the whole board if that's what it takes. I should have done it 12 years ago. I'm doing it now. Mason looked at this broken, guilty man across the table and felt something complicated move through him. Anger, yes, real and justified, but underneath it, something closer to recognition. A man who'd been afraid. A man who'd made the wrong choice under pressure and carried the weight of it for over a decade. 12 years is a long time to carry something like that. Mason said finally, voice steady. I'm not going to pretend it didn't cost me everything. It did. But you're doing the right thing now, and that matters. That matters a lot. Chen's shoulders sagged, something releasing in him that had clearly been coiled tight for over a decade. Evelyn was already pulling out her tablet, all business again, voice crisp. Mr. Chen, if you're willing, I'd like to get a formal statement recorded today while we're all together. My legal team can have documentation ready within the hour. Chen nodded, resolute now, in a way he hadn't been when they'd first sat down. Let's do it. I'm done being scared of that man. The formal statement changed everything, and Richard Voss knew it within hours. Mason found out later, much later, once the full picture finally came together, that Voss had spent that entire evening making increasingly desperate calls, first to lawyers, then to old contacts he hadn't spoken to in years. Finally, in a moment of pure panic, to a records management contractor the company used for off-site server storage. The call was recorded. Company policy, standard practice for vendor lines, something Voss apparently forgot in his panic, or simply gambled wouldn't matter anymore. I need the Mark 7 test archive wiped, Voss said, voice tight and fast on the recording Evelyn's legal team obtained 2 days later. All of it. Server cluster 4. Everything tagged to that project number. Tonight, if you can manage it. Sir, that requires executive authorization and a formal deletion request through legal. I am the authorization. Just do it. I'll handle the paperwork after. Sir, I really can't just... Do you want to keep this contract or not? The recording ended there, the vendor apparently hesitant enough to flag the unusual request to their own compliance department instead of executing it. A small, unglamorous act of caution from someone Mason would never meet that ended up mattering more than almost anything else in the entire fight. Evelyn called Mason the moment she confirmed it, voice tight with fury. He tried to destroy the archive, last night, after Chen's statement went into the file. She was pacing. Mason could hear it in the rhythm of her breathing. The vendor refused without proper authorization and flagged it internally instead. We have the recording. We have Chen's statement. We have the data card. Your note the tracker from your property. She stopped, took a breath, steadied herself. Mason, this is enough. This is more than enough. The board is calling an emergency session tomorrow morning. Mason gripped the phone tighter, something enormous and unfamiliar rising in his chest. Not quite relief. Not yet, but something close enough to touch it. What happens at the session? Voss gets confronted with everything we have in front of the full board on the record, and unless he's got some miracle explanation for a recorded call ordering evidence destruction. Mason. Her voice caught just slightly. I think this is the day it finally ends. Mason didn't sleep that night either, but for the first time in weeks, it wasn't fear keeping him up. He sat in the garage, with all 4 finished engines catching the low light, the 5th half assembled on the bench in front of him, and let himself think. Really think about how close he'd come to letting this all stay buried. If Duke hadn't stopped the truck. If Mason hadn't looked twice at the sunlight catching that stamp. If he'd let Denning's $15,000 talk him into walking away before he ever found the note. 12 years of quiet, forgotten grief. And it had all come down to one moment of noticing something the world had told him wasn't worth a second look. Lily wandered out around midnight, same as she had so many times these past weeks, climbing onto the stool beside the workbench without a word, watching him work in comfortable silence for a while before finally speaking. Are we winning, Dad? Mason set down his wrench, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. I think we might be, he said slowly. I think for the first time in a really long time, we actually might be. Lily smiled, small, tired but real, and leaned her head against his arm. I always knew we would. You didn't know that. You're 9. I knew it anyway, she said matter of fact, the way only kids could be about things that mattered most. Because you never stopped, even when everybody said you should. That's how I knew. Mason pulled her close chest tight, with something too big for words, and looked out at the 5 engines surrounding them, proof finally undeniably that everything he'd built and everything he'd lost had never actually been a failure at all. It had just been waiting. The same way he had. His phone buzzed on the workbench, breaking the quiet. A text from Evelyn sent at nearly 1 in the morning, 4 words that made his whole body go still. Board session moved up. Tomorrow, 9 a.m. Come. Mason looked at the message a long time. Heart-pounding 12 years of buried truth about to finally get its day in a room full of people who'd once decided he didn't matter enough to hear it. What is it? Lily asked, feeling him tense beside her. Mason looked down at his daughter, then back at the engines, then finally back at the screen, and felt something settle deep and certain in his chest. Tomorrow, he said quietly, we find out if 12 years of believing I wasn't crazy was worth it. Mason didn't remember getting dressed the next morning. He didn't remember the drive to the airport, or boarding the small charter plane Evelyn had arranged, or much of the flight itself. His mind kept looping back to the same 12 words scrolling behind his eyes like a ticker tape. Tomorrow, we find out if 12 years of believing I wasn't crazy was worth it. What he did remember clearly sharply was Lily's face at the front door that morning, dressed for school, but refusing to leave until she'd hugged him twice. You're gonna go tell them the truth. That's the plan. Then they have to believe you. She said it with the flat, absolute certainty only a 9-year-old could manage, like belief was a switch other people simply hadn't flipped yet. Because it's true, and true things are supposed to win. Mason had knelt down and hugged her a 3rd time longer than necessary, memorizing the smell of her shampoo and the warmth of her arms around his neck, because some small superstitious part of him needed one more piece of armor before walking into a room that had destroyed him once already. "I love you, Lil." "Love you too. Go be a genius." He was still holding on to that when the SUV pulled up outside Hart Automotive's headquarters, a glass tower that dwarfed everything around it. The same building Mason hadn't set foot in for 12 years, the same lobby he'd once walked through with his head high, and a badge that said he belonged there. Evelyn was waiting at the entrance, sharper and more composed than Mason had seen her, yet dressed like a woman about to walk into war. "You ready?" "No," Mason admitted, "but I'm going anyway. That's usually how the important ones go." She fell into step beside him, voice dropping lower as they crossed the lobby. "Boards assembled. Voss doesn't know the full scope of what we have, yet he thinks this is a routine review of the disposal irregularities. He has no idea Chen gave a statement. No idea about the recorded call." She glanced at Mason, something steadying in her expression. "The element of surprise is the only advantage we have left. Use it." The boardroom was exactly as intimidating as Mason remembered from 12 years ago. All glass and dark wood, and men and women in suits, worth more than his truck seated around a table long enough to seat 20. He recognized almost no one. 12 years had turned over most of the faces except one. Richard Voss sat near the head of the table, silver-templed, and composed a folder open in front of him, the picture of calm executive confidence. He looked up as Mason walked in, and for just a fraction of a second, so brief, Mason almost missed it, something flickered behind his eyes. Recognition. Then fear. Then, fast enough to nearly convince Mason he'd imagined it, a smooth, practiced smile slid back into place. "Mason Reed," Voss said, extending a hand across the table like the last 12 years had never happened. "It's been a long time." Mason looked at the hand, didn't take it. "It has," he said. "Longer for some of us than others, I imagine." A ripple of discomfort moved through the room. Voss's smile faltered just slightly before he sat back down, adjusting his jacket with hands that weren't quite as steady as he wanted them to look. Evelyn took her seat at the head of the table, and the room's energy shifted immediately, every eye turning toward her. "Thank you all for adjusting your schedules on short notice," she began, voice clear, controlled, carrying easily through the room. 2 weeks ago, 6 prototype engines from the Mark 7 program disposed of as scrap over a decade ago were delivered to a private repair shop belonging to their original lead engineer. She let that land, watching several board members exchange confused glances. "Since then, we've documented a pattern of escalating attempts to reclaim or discredit those engines, and the man who built them, originating from within this company." A board member near the middle of the table, older, silver-haired, clearly skeptical, cleared his throat. "Evelyn, with respect, this sounds like a disposal logistics issue, not a board-level matter. Why exactly are we—" "Because the man in question was terminated 12 years ago for engineering failures that never actually happened," Evelyn said, cutting him off cleanly. "Because I have a data card showing manually tampered calibration settings signed off under the authority of someone sitting at this table right now. Because I have a recorded phone call from 2 nights ago, in which that same person ordered the destruction of the entire Mark 7 test archive." She looked directly at Voss as she said it, and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "And because I have a formal signed statement from the technician who performed that tampering explaining exactly who instructed him to do it and why." The room went dead silent. Voss's face had gone pale, then blotchy, his hands gripping the edge of the table hard enough that his knuckles whitened. "This is—" His voice cracked and he cleared his throat, tried again, tried to sound composed. "This is a serious accusation, Evelyn, based on what sounds like circumstantial—" "It's not circumstantial, Richard." Evelyn's voice stayed perfectly level, and somehow that made it worse, more devastating than if she'd shouted. "I have the recording. Would you like to hear it played for the board right now?" Voss said nothing. His jaw worked silently, and for the first time in 12 years, Mason watched the man who'd destroyed his life sit utterly, completely powerless. Evelyn nodded to her assistant, and the recording played through the room's speakers, Voss's own voice filling the space tight and desperate. I need the Mark 7 test archive wiped, all of it, tonight if you can manage it. Several board members visibly recoiled. The silver-haired skeptic from earlier sat back in his chair like he'd been physically struck. "Richard," said a woman near the far end of the table, voice sharp with disbelief. "Is that your voice?" Voss didn't answer. He was staring at the table hands, still gripping the edge, and Mason watched 12 years of quiet, righteous fury finally get its moment. Not with shouting, not with revenge, but with simple, undeniable truth playing out loud in a room he'd once been walked out of like a criminal. "I'd like to introduce Mr. Reed's evidence directly." Evelyn continued unmoved by the tension thickening around the table. "Mr. Reed, would you like to speak?" Mason stood slowly, 12 years of rehearsed silence, finally finding its moment, and looked around the table at faces he'd never met. People who had no idea what had actually happened to him. People who'd inherited a company built partly on the wreckage of a lie. 12 years ago, I designed an engine platform this company called its most ambitious project ever attempted. Mason said, voice steadier than he expected, steadier than he felt. 4 days before the final demonstration, someone ordered the calibration on Bay 3, manually altered, twice specifically to make my engine fail, under stress testing, in front of the exact people whose approval I needed to keep my job and my project alive. He pulled the folded note from his jacket pocket, worn soft now, from being handled so many times over the past 2 weeks. "I found this hidden inside one of the engines I built." My own note written the same week reporting the tampering directly to Richard Voss. He never responded. 2 days later, my career was over. He set the note down on the table, careful, deliberate, and let it sit there in the silence. "I spent 12 years believing I'd simply failed." Mason continued, voice thickening despite his effort to keep it level. "I lost my job. I lost my reputation. I lost the ability to look at my own daughter and tell her what her father actually used to do for a living, because every version of that story ended with me being the one who wasn't good enough." He looked directly at Voss now, and something in his voice hardened. "I wasn't the one who wasn't good enough. I was the one who was inconvenient to somebody protecting his own career." The silver-haired board member leaned forward, expression grim. "Mr. Voss, do you have anything to say in response to these allegations?" Voss looked up, and for a moment Mason almost felt something close to pity for the man watching him search for an exit that didn't exist anymore. "The Bay 3 calibration issue," Voss started, voice unsteady, "was a judgment call at the time regarding budget concerns that was ordering evidence destroyed 2 nights ago, also a judgment call regarding budget concerns." Evelyn cut in sharp as a blade. Voss's mouth opened, closed, opened again. No words came out. "I think," Evelyn said quietly into the silence that followed, "the board has heard enough." The vote to formally suspend Richard Voss pending full termination and legal review took less than 15 minutes. Mason watched it happen almost in a daze. 12 years of buried grief finally getting an ending. He'd stopped believing he'd ever see. Not with fireworks, not with drama, just a room full of tired, shocked executives raising their hands one by one, dismantling in a quarter of an hour what had taken Voss over a decade to build on the ashes of Mason's career. Voss was escorted out by 2 security guards before the meeting even fully adjourned, face blank with the particular kind of shock that comes from watching your entire, carefully constructed life collapse in real time. He didn't look at Mason on his way out. Mason found to his own surprise that he didn't need him to. The revenge Mason had never let himself want had arrived anyway, quiet and complete, and it felt less like triumph and more like exhaling after holding his breath for 12 straight years. Evelyn found him afterward in the hallway outside the boardroom, leaning against the wall, hands shaking with the sheer aftershock of it all. "You did that," she said quietly, coming to stand beside him. 12 years of silence, and you walked in there and dismantled him in under 20 minutes. "You did most of it," Mason said. "The recording, the board, all of it." "I opened the door." Evelyn's expression was warm now, something genuine breaking through the sharp executive composure she usually wore like armor. "You're the one who found the truth buried in a box of scrap metal and refused to let it stay buried. That part was all you, Mr. Reed." Mason huffed out something between a laugh and a sob, exhaustion and vindication tangling together in his chest until he couldn't tell which was which anymore. "What happens now?" "Now," Evelyn said, "we make it official. Full public statement, full credit restoration, formal reinstatement of your name on the Mark 7 program records. And—" She hesitated, something almost hopeful creeping into her voice. "If you're willing, I'd like to talk about what happens to those 6 engines once they're finished. Because based on what my engineering team has already seen, Mr. Reed, this isn't just a wrongful termination story anymore." "What is it then?" Evelyn smiled, the first fully unguarded smile Mason had seen from her since they'd met. "It might be the biggest engineering platform this company launches in the next decade." The public statement went out 3 days later, and this time, there was no ambiguity in it at all. Hart Automotive formally acknowledged that its former senior vice president of engineering had orchestrated the wrongful termination of lead engineer Mason Reed 12 years prior through deliberate manipulation of test data during the Mark 7 prototype program. The company announced full credit restoration for Mason's original design work, a formal public apology, and buried a few paragraphs down the detail that would end up dominating headlines within 24 hours, an initial settlement figure large enough to make Mason's hands shake when he first read it on his phone. But it was the video that really broke the story wide open. Sarah Coleman from Channel 9 ran a follow-up segment, this one filmed inside Mason's garage camera, panning slowly across 6 engines lined against the wall. 5 finished, now gleaming restored proof, stamped in steel, of everything the world had once called worthless. The segment went viral within a day. Not local viral, national. Mason watched the view count climb from his kitchen table. Lily curled up beside him, scrolling through comments on her own tablet, gasping every few seconds at another wave of strangers weighing in. "Dad? Dad, look at this one." She turned the screen toward him, eyes wide. "This guy says you're an inspiration to every dad who ever got knocked down and had to start over. He's got like 4,000 likes." Mason read it throat tight. "That's nice of him. There's like 100 comments like that." Lily kept scrolling, awe creeping into her voice. "Dad, I think you're famous. I think it's a slow news week. Dad." She looked up at him, dead serious, the same look she'd given him weeks ago in this exact kitchen when this whole impossible thing had started. "You're not just famous because of the engines. You're famous because you didn't give up. That's what everybody's saying. Look," she scrolled further. "This whole comment section is just people saying they needed to hear a story like this right now." Mason pulled her closer, chest tight with something too big to properly name, and looked out through the kitchen window at the garage where 6 engines, his engines finally fully, undeniably his, again sat waiting for the last chapter of a story, 12 years in the making. Earl showed up the next morning with a cooler full of beer and an expression like a man trying very hard not to say, "I told you so," despite having said the exact opposite for weeks. "Whole town's talking about nothing else," Earl said, setting the cooler down on the garage floor with a grunt. "Deb's putting up a sign at the diner, home of Mason Reed, genius engineer. I told her that seemed like a stretch and she about took my head off." Mason laughed, wiping grease off his hands, the sound coming easier now than it had in weeks. "Tell her thank you, but maybe pump the brakes on the sign. Already tried. Woman doesn't listen to reason once she's got a paint can in her hand." Earl leaned against the workbench, studying the 5th engine, with something like genuine awe, now all traces of his old mockery gone. "You really built all this by yourself 12 years ago?" "By myself with a team, yeah." Mason ran a hand along the polished casing, still not quite used to looking at his own work and seeing something worth being proud of instead of something worth hiding. "This one right here was the one I was proudest of. The compression system. Took me 11 months to solve, and I remember the day it finally worked. I called Carol crying because I couldn't believe it actually ran." Earl went quiet at the mention of Carol, respectful in the particular way small-town men are when grief comes up unexpected. She'd be proud of you, Mason. Real proud. I hope so. Mason's voice caught just briefly. I think about that a lot lately. Whether she'd recognize the guy standing in this garage now, or whether the last 12 years changed me too much. She'd recognize you, Earl said with more certainty than Mason expected from a man who'd never actually met her. Way Lily talks about you, way this whole town's rallying behind you now that the truth's out. You're still the same guy who built these things in the first place. You just got buried under some other guy's lie for a while. That's all that happened. That's not the same as changing. Mason looked at him for a long moment, something settling warm and grateful in his chest. Thanks, Earl. Don't get sappy on me. Earl cracked open a beer, handed one to Mason, grinning again, the teasing edge creeping back in, but gentler now, kinder. Just get these last engine finished, so I can tell people I knew the famous inventor guy, back when he still owed me $20 for a busted alternator. 2 weeks later, the sixth and final engine came together on a cold, bright morning. Mason's hands steady. Sure, 12 years of doubt, finally fully quiet in his chest. Evelyn arrived that afternoon with a full engineering team in tow, transforming Mason's small garage into something resembling a proper test facility for one long, extraordinary day. Diagnostic equipment monitoring rigs, a dozen serious professionals crowded into a space that had until recently mostly seen tractor repairs and leaking radiators. "You ready?" Evelyn asked, standing beside him, as the first fully restored engine was mounted onto the test rig. Mason looked at the 6 engines, at the note and the data card, and the photograph of Carol now framed on the garage wall, where he could see it every single day at 12 years of grief, finally arriving at something that felt for the first time like closure instead of loss. "I've been ready for 12 years, he said. "Let's see what it does." The engine roared to life, and the readings on the monitoring equipment made 3 separate engineers go completely silent, staring at their screens like they didn't quite trust what they were seeing. Mason! One of them, a young woman named Priya, sharp-eyed, and clearly not prone to overstatement, turned to him with something close to disbelief written across her face. "These compression numbers, this thermal efficiency, these specs are beating our current production line by almost 15%, and this design is 12 years old." It was ahead of its time, Evelyn said quietly, watching Mason's face rather than the screens. "I told you it was." They ran all 6 engines that day, one after another, each result better than the last, and by the time the sun went down, the small garage on Route 9 had officially witnessed the resurrection of what Evelyn's engineering team would later call, in an internal memo that somehow leaked to the press within days, the most significant untapped propulsion platform in company history. Mason stood in the middle of it all, surrounded by people and expensive equipment and clipboards, and felt Lily's small hand slip into his. She'd come home from school just in time to watch the last test run, and now stood pressed against his side, eyes wide, taking in the chaos of engineers and equipment that had transformed her father's quiet garage into something out of a movie. "Dad," she whispered, awed. "You actually did it." "We did it," Mason said, squeezing her hand. "You believed in this before anybody else did, remember. Before I even fully believed it myself." "I always believe in you," Lily said simply, like it was the most obvious fact in the world. "That's just how it works." The formal announcement came a month later at a press conference. Mason never in 1,000 years would have imagined standing in front of Hart Automotive's headquarters, a wall of cameras, Evelyn Hart at the podium beside him, the 6 restored engines displayed on a stage behind them, like the trophies they'd finally rightfully become. 12 years ago, Evelyn said, addressing the room with the same calm, steady authority she'd carried into every difficult moment of the past 2 months. "This company made a grave mistake. We allowed one man's ambition to destroy another man's career, and we buried a genuinely revolutionary piece of engineering because it was inconvenient to the truth someone else wanted told." She turned, gesturing toward Mason, standing beside her, grease still faintly staining the creases of his hands despite 3 showers that morning. "Today we're correcting that mistake. Effective immediately, Mason Reed's name is formally and permanently restored to the Mark 7 engine platform. The technology his team originally developed will move forward into production under his direct engineering leadership, and Hart Automotive is proud, genuinely deeply proud, to finally give credit where it was always owed. The room erupted into questions, cameras flashing, reporters shouting over each other, and Mason stood frozen for a moment, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of a moment that had started 12 years ago, with a handshake that turned out to mean nothing at all. He found Lily's face in the small crowd off to the side, seated with Pete and Earl and half the town who'd made the drive out just to watch, and something in her proud, beaming expression steadied him enough to finally step up to the microphone himself. "I'm not going to pretend the last 12 years were easy," Mason said, voice shaking slightly before steadying, finding the same quiet certainty that had carried him through every impossible moment since a truck first pulled into his driveway. "I lost my career. I lost my reputation. I lost the version of myself who believed the world was generally fair to people who worked hard and told the truth." He paused, looking out at the crowd, at reporters and engineers, and further back, his own small daughter, watching him with total, unwavering belief. "But I never lost the belief that what I built was real, even when nobody else believed it, even when I started to doubt it myself some mornings. I kept that belief buried the same way those engines got buried, quiet, forgotten, but never actually gone." He took a breath, steadying himself one more time. "I want every person watching this who's ever been told they failed, who's ever had someone else's lie become the story of their life. I want you to know that the truth doesn't disappear just because somebody powerful decides to bury it. Sometimes it just waits. And if you keep showing up, keep doing the work, keep believing in what you know is true, even when nobody else does. Sometimes 12 years later, a truck pulls up in your driveway and the whole thing comes back around." The room went quiet for a moment, then erupted into applause, and Mason felt something in his chest finally fully release. 12 years of grief and doubt and quiet, stubborn hope, all of it landing at last on solid ground. The settlement, once finalized, came to just over $3 million, full back pay damages, licensing royalties on the Mark 7 platform moving forward, and a formal consulting position that would let Mason keep his hands on the project without ever having to leave the small town that had watched him rebuild his entire life from a scrapyard's worth of forgotten steel. He didn't move away. Didn't trade the small garage on Route 9 for some glass office in the city, despite Evelyn offering it more than once. "I like it here," Mason told her the day they signed the final paperwork, sitting in his own kitchen instead of some corporate conference room. "This town watched me lose everything. Seems fitting they get to watch me build it back up too." Evelyn had smiled at that, genuine and warm. "The consulting arrangement means you can work from anywhere you want, Mason. Nobody's asking you to leave." "I know, I just wanted to say it out loud anyway." He used part of the settlement to pay off the shop's loan in full. The same loan that had nearly cost him everything. Just weeks earlier, cleared with a single phone call that felt almost anticlimactic after everything it had threatened to take from him. He fixed the roof. He put money away for Lily's future, more than he'd ever imagined being able to offer her enough that whatever she wanted to become someday, money would never be the thing standing in her way. And because a promise was a promise, he finally got her the dog. A scrappy, oversized mutt from the shelter 2 towns over, all paws and ears and boundless, chaotic energy that Lily named Torque, without a second's hesitation, deeply pleased with her own cleverness. "Get it like Torque from the engines." "I get it," Mason said, laughing, as the dog knocked over a toolbox in its enthusiasm to explore the garage. "Pretty sure that dog's gonna cost me more in broken parts than the actual engines did." "Worth it," Lily said, scratching Torque's ears with total devotion. "Everything's worth it now." Richard Voss's story ended quietly, the way these things sometimes do. No dramatic courtroom scene, no headline-grabbing perp walk, just a slow, grinding collapse that played out over the following months. Formal termination. A civil suit that Hart Automotive's legal team pursued, with the same precision Evelyn had brought to every part of Mason's fight. Voss's name, once printed on award plaques and industry magazine profiles, quietly scrubbed from public materials, replaced everywhere it had once appeared with Mason's own. Mason never sought him out, never asked for an apology he suspected wouldn't be genuine, even if it came. The vindication had never been about making Voss suffer. It had only ever been about the truth finally standing where it belonged out in the open, instead of buried behind a timing cover 12 years deep. David Chen, for his part, kept his word. His formal statement became a cornerstone of the case, and in the months that followed, he and Mason found themselves unexpectedly becoming something like friends. Two men who'd both been shaped by the same 12-year-old lie, finally free of it, finally able to talk about what it had cost them, without either flinching away from the conversation. "I still think about it," Chen admitted once, the two of them sharing coffee on Mason's back porch, Torque sprawled between their feet. "What I could have done differently. Whether I should have just refused, taken whatever consequences came." "You did the right thing eventually," Mason said. "That's what matters now. A lot of people never find their way to doing the right thing at all." "Doesn't erase 12 years, though." "No," Mason agreed quietly. "It doesn't, but it's a start. Sometimes a start's enough to build something new on top of." On a bright, clear morning, almost exactly 1 year after that first truck pulled into his driveway, Mason stood in a very different garage, larger now, a proper facility. Evelyn's company had helped him build right there on his own property. 6 engine bays instead of 1. A small team of engineers he'd personally handpicked, working alongside him on the next generation of the Mark 7 platform. Lily sat on an overturned crate nearby, older by a year, sharper by twice that, sketching something in a notebook with the same intense focus Mason recognized from his own younger self, back before the world had tried so hard to convince him his focus didn't matter. "What are you drawing?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag as he walked over. She turned the notebook toward him, revealing a rough, earnest sketch of an engine block covered in labeled parts that were mostly right, a few charmingly, confidently wrong. "I want to learn," she said, matter of fact, like it was the most natural thing in the world. "I want to build things too, like you did." Mason knelt down beside her, throat tight, in the particular way it had been tightening more and more often lately, not from grief this time, but from something fuller. Something that felt finally entirely like joy. "Then I'll teach you everything I know," he said. "Every bit of it. Even the part about never giving up. Even when everybody says you're wasting your time. Especially that part," Mason said, pulling her into a hug, looking out over 6 engines gleaming under the morning light, proof stamped in steel that value never truly disappears. It just waits sometimes for 12 long years for someone brave enough, stubborn enough to look twice and see what everyone else had already decided wasn't worth saving. A billionaire once called these engines worthless. A forgotten single father proved with nothing but patience, grief, and unshakable belief that some of the most valuable things in this world are the ones the world gives up on first. And that no lie, however carefully buried, stays buried forever when the truth still has someone left willing to dig.